work too because of all those things, but also present a number of really interesting environmental factors to the work that you do. So we're incredibly appreciative of the way you do it, and that's certainly not been something that's come up during those conversations.
So if I could, before we get too far into the conversation, I just want to
Please.
make sure I get a few points out there. On the Vermont Criminal Justice Training Council website, they posted a message, and I just think it's important to before we start our conversation, to really grasp what it says. So it says, this fair and impartial policing policy was approved by the council at its regular meeting on December 7th of 2017 and replaces all other versions of this policy. Agencies are required by March 1st of 2018 to adopt every provision in this policy verbatim. Agencies are free to add further language as long as it doesn't contradict any provision of this policy. Agencies wishing to retain the language in their current policy must submit that policy to the council and have it evaluated by the Attorney General's office for a determination regarding its compliance with the provisions of this policy. And then also in the actual statute, to encourage consistent, fair, and impartial policing practices statewide. This is, let me skip ahead. So this is Title 20, Section 2366, subsection B. To encourage consistent, fair, and impartial policing practices statewide, the Criminal Justice Training Council, in consultation with the Attorney General, shall review the policies of law enforcement agencies and constables required to adopt a policy pursuant to subsection A of this section to ensure those policies establish each component of the model policy on or before April 15th, 2018. If the council finds that a policy does not meet each component of the model policy, it shall work with the law enforcement agency or constable to bring the policy into compliance. If after consultation with its attorney or with the council or with both, the law enforcement agency or constable fails to adopt a policy that meets each component of the model policy, that agency or constable shall be deemed to have adopted and shall follow and enforce the model policy issued by the council. Annually, as part of their training report to the council, every state, county, and municipal law enforcement agency and every constable who exercises law enforcement authority pursuant to 24 VSA 1936A and who is trained in compliance with Section 2358 of this title shall report to the council whether the agency or officer has adopted a fair and impartial policing policy in accordance with subsections A-B. The Criminal Justice Training Council shall determine, as part of the council's annual certification of training requirements, whether current officers have received training on fair and impartial policing as required under Title 20 VSA 2358. And then it says, the last section, annually on April 1st, the Criminal Justice Training Council shall report to the House and Senate committees on judiciary regarding which departments and officers have adopted a fair and impartial policing policy and whether officers have received training on fair and impartial policing. So I think those are just some important points for us operationally, making sure that we're in compliance with the state statute. And I'm welcome to open up the conversation.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that gives a little context as to where the impetus from this has come from, where it's going. Okay, so last time there were a number of issues that came up on different items and one particular clause individually. So when we left the last meeting, we had kind of talked about as liaison to the public safety area and somebody who's sort of worked quite a bit with Chief and Jesse on this too. Eric was going to kind of work at some potential language conversations in regards to some concerns. You expressed an interest in bringing forward some potential ideas around coming to a policy. I mean, so, you know, just before we go into that, let's be really clear that when we're getting to this level of conversation, it's really a conversation about the council's interest in passing a policy that reflects the values of the community. That's something, a thread that's consistently come up throughout this. I want to be really clear that operationally, we have nothing but evidence that states that we are already policing in a manner that's very consistent with the approach and I think the philosophy that's been consistently expressed in Winooski, which is being a very welcoming community and a community that stands behind all of our residents, regardless of their background, their status, immigration status, and how they came to become a member of this community. So let's be really quick to bifurcate those two conversations. Is from an operational standpoint, we're not really having a conversation. This is really about policy that we've been asked to pass that has some language in it that perhaps not everybody agrees with, that we're going to discuss this evening. So with that, I kind of want to quickly turn it around just because we've done a lot of prep work on this conversation to council. Is there anything else from a staff perspective want to come up? So I want to turn this over pretty quickly to council to open up conversation about kind of where we're at with specific points in the policy and see if there's any proposals that folks want to make the change with the understanding of the potential ramifications of making any of those changes. So I'll open up the floor, council.
Yeah, well, I think with that, you hit on some really important points that, you know, we've talked a lot in this council about our values in regards to the diversity of our community. And I feel really proud to live in a community that doesn't just celebrate that, but uplifts it as a community asset. I mean, we have a lot of neighbors that come from many different walks of life, and I feel like our FIP policy is really where the rubber meets the road on how we are actually enshrining those values that we pay lip service to in the way City of Winooski excuse me, services are available to members of our community. And I think one of the things that's important to note as we're discussing the model policy that is before us is that there are a lot of elements that are absolutely a really important step in the right direction of ensuring that we're conducting policing in a non-biased way, and that individuals in our community can feel comfortable accessing Winooski Police Department resources and having contact with employees of the Winooski Police Department without fear that we are going to be participating in the enforcement of federal civil immigration law. But I think it's really important to note in looking at the legislative intent for the state pulling together a model policy is that the model policy is really intended to be a floor rather than a ceiling. And I think, like Rick mentioned, a lot of the language in statute requires that as a municipality we shall adopt a fair and impartial policing policy that includes at a minimum, the elements of the Criminal Justice Training Council model policy. I think within that, there are about 5 areas of significant concern that leave some pretty significant loopholes in potential issues or problems that, due to those loopholes, don't set out clear guidance for Winooski Police Department employee interaction with federal immigration enforcement authorities. I've put together an email you should have gotten an email from the city clerk with with an attachment to this section of our agenda tonight that kind of outlines those 5 areas that I'm sure we will talk about, and I'm happy to kind of walk through what some of those areas of concern are. And I think in addition to those, it's really important that as a community and as the most diverse community in Vermont, we draw, like we've talked about in prior council meetings, a really bright, clear red line between federal civil immigration law and our functions in carrying out public safety through the way policing is done in Winooski. I think that there's a tremendous public safety benefit to all community members. And I also think it's really important to keep in mind that the enforcement of federal civil immigration law, Winooski Police Department members don't have the authority to enforce. So I think you'll see in the information that was passed along to you prior, those 5 areas of concern that we can talk through, in addition to my recommendation that we draw that really bright red line and say that the members of our Winooski Police Department will not participate in or assist with the investigation or enforcement of federal civil immigration law. And those recommendations and that language is also available to members of the public, so it's been posted in the public folder on the website. But for folks who aren't like us and sitting up here with laptops, I do have printouts of that, and I'm happy to.
You can do it on your phone. You can find it on your phone.
Agreement that this is going to be a safe place for people to live, and it's going to be a place where people can come to their municipality for services across the board, whether it be at the clerk's window or the police department or a parks and recreation program, with an expectation that the service will be provided to each member of this community regardless of their immigration status. And it's just not something that we think about when we provide those services. So just from a philosophical perspective, I think we can argue about the details, but from a values perspective, that's been really consistent from this body. Want to open up, and I want to make that point because I think there can be disagreement about the process pieces and the specific points, but there can still that can still be the prevailing value of the community that's being represented. So with that, I think it's probably pretty important that we open up. And Eric, if you want to walk through just kind of quickly and very quickly in these terms what the points are, in case there's any specific items that folks want to discuss.
Yeah, so if you see, starting on page 2 of what got sent around to you, that's where we start to outline the 5 sections. First, before we get into some of those sections, is a little bit of where we discuss that bright red line between either the investigation or enforcement of federal civil immigration law and our policing. So the proposal is to strike, you'll see throughout the policy itself, what's savings clause references to federal statute 1373 and 1644. Those govern essentially, those provisions in federal statutes say that municipalities or states must share information related to immigration or immigration status with federal immigration enforcement authorities. There's a lot of thought at a national level in regards to whether or not 1373 in and of itself is constitutional. It has not been enforced by any administration prior to the current administration. There are currently some mounting constitutional challenges to certain portions of Section 1373. But I'm proposing we draw that clear bright red line and say, no, we will not be assisting or participating in immigration enforcement in the policing work that we do by striking those savings clause references. Because if you read the actual policy, essentially there'll be a section that says, Winooski Police Department employees won't communicate information to federal immigration authorities except under the provisions of Section 1373. So I'm saying we strike that and create that bright red line that says we won't communicate that information to federal immigration authorities. If you move down Section 8, F and D, there are some concerns in this section because immigration was not included alongside personal characteristics for reasons by which a Winooski Police Department employee would determine whether or not to cite and release somebody or hold them in custody. And I think from a value standpoint, it's pretty important that immigration status should not at all be used as criteria for whether or not we release somebody or decide to detain them or seek additional detainment. or additional, seek to hold them in custody longer. That should be on the issue, the criminal violation that we might be interacting with that individual for. So I think that that's pretty self-explanatory. In section 9, there are some concerns around this section because the enforcement of federal civil immigration violation, Winooski Police Department employees do not have the authority to enforce. Being in the country unlawfully is a civil violation. However, crossing the border unlawfully for some individuals may be a federal criminal violation, which Winooski Police Department employees do have the authority to enforce. However, the way this section is written, it creates an environment by which pretext can be used in some pretty significant ways to detain somebody who maybe have thought to have crossed the border, and really at the end of the day, it's not relevant to the public safety responsibility of Winooski Police Department employees. So the language that I proposed closes kind of that problematic loophole and makes it pretty clear that unless a suspect is actually apprehended in that process of crossing a border unlawfully, we kind of close up that loophole there. Section 10, subsection D, there are some concerns here in regards to information being shared about victims and witnesses of crime, and I think that that's absolutely, something we should not give any grounds on. If somebody is a victim or a witness of crime, they should feel as comfortable as possible cooperating with the investigation or being able to give their information to our Winooski Police Department employees without fear that we are going to transmit that information to federal immigration control authorities. So the language in this section was a little bit weak and doesn't really provide that assurance. Section 11, subsection A, there was some concern here because there may be circumstances where it is appropriate for a host of reasons for Winooski Police Department employees to have some level of cooperation with federal immigration enforcement authorities. However, the language that was included in the model policy creates exceptions for the ability to cooperate or share information with those authorities that are so broad. Essentially, they could be in a number of inappropriate reasons could be used to share information with immigration control authorities based on what those carve-outs were in the proposed policy. So the language I've provided just tightens that up and makes it really clear that unless it's necessary to the ongoing investigation of a felony, so let's say, for instance, if there was an investigation related to human trafficking, that is an area where ICE, for instance, might have some information or be involved in that investigation, and it would be appropriate to have that level of collaboration and information sharing. Those types of situations would rise to a criminal felony level, and so this still allows us to have that carve out so that we can be nimble and respond in those extreme and important circumstances. And then the last section is really self-explanatory and really easy. In the model policy, it sets really clear provisions that Winooski Police Department employees will not propose granting access to individuals we have in our custody to immigration enforcement authorities. However, that creates a pretty substantial loophole where if the reverse is true, where an immigration enforcement authority sees that we have somebody in our custody through federal database systems, or for whatever reason, if they just happen to have that knowledge on their own, they could still call and request access, and there's nothing barring that access from being granted. So it's a really simple language change that just changes from proposing granting access to granting access, which I think much better encapsulates what the intent of that section is, which is saying that we are not going to utilize City of Winooski resources when we have somebody in our custody to be able to grant access to those individuals who are in our custody to immigration enforcement authorities. So that wraps up those sections. I'm happy to take any questions or comments.
So you guys have had sort of a limited amount of time to look at those, and in no way, shape, or form am asking for any kind of legal analysis, because that's a long rabbit hole, and we'll try to make the question to make it so it can be a very simple answer too, and that is there anything from these operations perspective that is instantly support?
No, I've stated time and again that we can operate with any policy that's given to us because we do not do civil immigration enforcement.
Good. So, the evening, which is what's being proposed, goes outside the proposed policy. Going outside the proposed policy, from what we're aware of perspective, right now would potentially put JAG funds, the Department of Justice funding for special initiatives in a lot of cases and equipment. Most recently, about $10,000 for the city of Winooski. So moving forward outside that policy could put those at risk. I want to point out that there's a lot of different conversations going on as in regards to what potential hypothetical repercussions could or could not come from any specific action related to this policy or anything to do with really any of this. And that's a maddening place to be, but it's where we are. So I want to acknowledge that, that would put us there. So I want to open it up for comments, questions, concerns. Eric put together some thoughts, shared them with everybody, and a proposal. And this is the time where I think we need to have a conversation about whether or not folks are open to straying from the proposed model policy. I'm sure we make that decision and then take any specifics in regards to the proposal that's here available. And given the turnout, I'm guessing, let's see. What's next? I'm guessing that everybody's not here for the National Recreation and Parks Association grant application. No offense, Ray, it's important. We'll also, because of the item, give folks a chance to speak. I'm going to ask that everybody try to keep their comments, if possible, to 2 minutes or less, and after council has a chance to discuss this briefly, we'll come back to that. So I just want folks to know there will be an opportunity for public comment ahead. Okay. So with that, I turn back towards council. I think the first question is, number one, is the body comfortable with straying from the model policy that's presented to us?
Can I ask a preliminary question? Are we sure that it's just a $10,000 JAG monies that would be hanging in the balance at this stage?
So that has not been tested yet, so we don't know. That's our understanding specifically from what we know is the prohibition, if called into question, would be specifically around funds to public safety. So that's the JAG grant we have. From a process perspective, I do think it's important to call out two other things that we would ask you, if you consider straying from this policy, to think about in the next months and years. One is the appropriation of funds for those, in place of those JAG funds that could be used from another pot of money to protect our officer safeties. That's what we've used those funds for before. We have funds we could pull from to fund that. Two is we are unclear what our legal obligation would be in the future, so it's an acknowledgement that there is a potential unfunded requirement there. And then three is our relationship with our federal partners. We partner with federal agencies, I wouldn't say extensively, but periodically in the interest of protecting the public safety. So thinking about how we partner with the individuals who are working with, not necessarily the agencies, but the individual law enforcement officers who are here in Vermont at the federal level, how we best partner with them and make them still feel part of our public safety team. So those are operationally from a process perspective. as the mayor and Eric and the chief have said, value-wise, I think we're in lockstep. It's really how we implement the change to ensure that we can continue to maintain the public safety. And we have some unknowns as part of that.
And to that point, I think the discussion was had last week in that, and I'll stand strong behind this, I think investing a lot of money in legal review that's proposed or otherwise, unless something really just looks way off, is not a good use of resources. I think what we're aware of is the potential from an interpretation that JAG funds are the only exposed funds. I think the reality is if there's any other news to that effect, then you're sitting down and having a conversation about this. Again, that's the reality of it. But I think trying to substantiate standing one way or another on an interpretation of federal law is overly onerous for us, and I think that if there's a decision to deviate from that policy, I think there just needs to be acknowledgement on this body's behalf that that's a risk that's being taken. And to Jesse's point, that there needs to be a reaction should there be some kind of extensive response or action required on behalf of us from a resource perspective.
I think it's interesting to note too that to date, no municipalities have had their JAG funding even taken away. So I think, and within that vein, there's no predicting what the current administration might throw down the pipe works, but by adopting a policy that we feel strongly about, we're also not saying, there's a million hypotheticals we could run through our heads, but if any of those hypotheticals were to ever actualize in the future, we have the opportunity to open this discussion back up and have that as a group.
Mayor, that's partially correct, but I will tell you that the 4 years that I've been applying for JAG grant funds, they were awarded by September, and the application's been in process since July, and to my knowledge, no money has been released to Vermont, and it won't be until policies have been provided to the Department of Justice.
Okay. And it's a 4-year running cycle from a funding perspective?
It's every year, every single year, so this is the 4th application. I've never had it not approved within 20 days. This was the one and only year, and I spoke with Director Gothier, and he advised it was in direct relation to the letter that the Department of Justice sent to the Department of Public Safety with their concerns about the current fair and impartial policing policy. So none of the Vermont money has been released.
Well, yeah, and I think the Secretary, the Attorney General's direction, and also from the Trading Council perspective, made that very clear to expect that as a repercussion.
Right. So normally, if it was just like implementing the motorcycle, things like that, I'd be happy to wait. This particular year, I wanted equipment to keep officers safe. One of the things, the majority, about 65% of the money was to buy ceramic rifle plates for the officers' vests that they could wear. That keeps them safe from rifle rounds, which we don't currently have.
Okay, and that was built into the 10,000. Great.
Outer carriers for those plates, and then the plates themselves.
Okay. So something tells me there will be great impetus on this body's behalf to ensure that that's covered through another means, and would probably recommend that we talk about earmarking a portion of fund balance for that purpose. Should this conversation continue on that path? Other comments, questions, concerns, and thoughts on doing policy?
Chief Hubert, you said that any deviation from the model policy has to be submitted to the AG's office for review.
Yes.
And then what? So are they accountable to the feds in terms of how they're reviewing the policy, or are they solely looking through state law filters when they're reviewing it? So that's one question I have, and then the other question is, are JAG funds the only funds from a federal source that support the police department or public safety?
So the answer to your first question is the Attorney General's office is supposed to work with municipalities to try and ensure compliance. If we just cannot reach a point where we provide a policy to them that they're happy with and they say that it's compliant, they will forward that along to the Department of Justice for them to review. We're just finishing up a COPS grant, which was a substantial grant. For 3 years, we're in our retention year now. So we're not technically spending federal dollars anymore. But that was a substantial grant of 250
With our match.
with our match, 250,000.
It allowed us to increase our police force by one.
Yes.
And the source of that, not just blanket, was Department of Justice or was just federal?
OJP, Office of Justice Programs.
Okay.
So I'm interested in the link between the Attorney General's office, their obligations to the federal government, and their obligations to enforce Vermont law. So there's multiple layers to this issue that I'm not sure I fully understand in terms of what happens next.
It's complicated, but my understanding from multiple conversations with Director Gothier is that the Attorney General's office was specifically cited in the statute to review policies. So they will review, and their job is to try and ensure compliance for Vermont.
Vermont law or Vermont and federal law?
Vermont municipalities.
I understand, but is the Attorney General's responsibility to also review those policies in light? I mean, Vermont law references federal law?
Yes, it's for federal law, possible, what could be conceived as violations of federal law.
Right.
So not legal advice here, but my understanding is that the Attorney General's office is responsible for reviewing and ensuring compliance with state statute, which says that model cohesive policy for law enforcement agencies and constables to adopt as a part of the agency or constable's own fair and impartial policing policy. And some of that language I read earlier. My understanding is that they have to review any policy we submit to ensure that it at least has those minimal elements and those minimum protections that are contained within the model policy.
Right, and they're also accountable to the federal government because they are recipients of federal funds. So there are functions that they need to fulfill as part of that relationship.
I don't think it says though in statute that they're responsible for ensuring that each municipality's model policy is compliant with federal law, only that the model policy is compliant with federal law, and that each municipality must have a policy that at least meets the minimum essential elements of the model policy.
So it's a collective bargaining, like the idea is they're trying to put forward something that if a smaller community especially adopts, then they have substantial sense that they're covered and won't have an issue. If you go off, then I'm sure they'll kind of be like, you're on your own. Then you're not involved in the collective bargaining any longer. You do not have that representation. I don't know that. I haven't seen that spelled out, but that would be my assumption is the Attorney General's office is going to go to bat for the model policy. Do something else on your own and don't substantiate to them that it's in compliance, you're probably on your own. That would be my guess, unless you have asked them to defend us too.
Yeah, I know that in other agencies that receive federal funds, they have an oversight function that is basically performing the federal function within the state. And I don't know anything about the Department of Justice and Attorney General's offices and the responsibilities that go back and forth, but I'm interested in receiving more information about the implications of this beyond JAG funds.
Well, I think that's part of the next step. So let's say we pass a policy, Rick has to submit that policy to the Training Council and the Attorney General's office for review, and then if the Attorney General's office takes major and substantive issue with the policy, then that's a discussion they begin to have with us. But if there's not like a lever where if they determine, oh no, we don't like the policy, then some switch is flipped and Winooski separates off and becomes its own little independent hamlet.
I just want to be really clear that what we're doing is knowingly violating federal law, and what we're saying is we don't need a legal review. What some have said is we don't need a legal review. We know what the repercussions are. I'm not sure we do fully know what the repercussions are. I have or any other municipalities, well, I guess, where did the language come from? And are other municipalities considering this language? You know, in terms of attorneys have developed it, is this being promoted in other municipalities?
So I don't know the answer to the second question in other municipalities reviewing it. I know that this is language that's been discussed through some of the groups that were a part of the process to create the model policy, some that were cited in statute as what's the word I'm looking for, as being brought in on consultation for the policy, and that language has been reviewed by the ACLU as well as the Immigrant Legal Resource Center. And attorneys at both of those organizations. And so that was language that was kind of arrived at through those groups that were referenced in statute as being a part of the process by which to create the state level policy. And I think, you know, I've heard from members of the legislature as well, frustration around the policy that emerged as the model policy not being a consensus policy that includes language that addresses these concerns that were brought forward by those groups specifically named in statute to be a part of the group that's putting together the policy.
But if part of the barrier to consensus was a need to include the savings clauses, which the Department of Justice told the Attorney General's office or whoever that we need to have in the policy, then it's no surprise that consensus wasn't reached, because that's the Attorney General's office is not going to rest all the federal funds that come into the state of Vermont.
I think that's absolutely true.
So I guess my point is, I'm not sure attorneys that represent municipalities and the municipal interests have worked through some of the implications around this. If they have, I'd love to know more about that. It feels, from a process standpoint, like not a good process to take language and not have a legal review. Understand that there's a lot of complexity with respect to the state has spoken, the feds have spoken, and knowingly violating federal law, irrespective of our views on how federal law is being implemented at the moment, needs to be, I think, really thoroughly vetted and understood. And the timing of this is a challenge for me. But we first found out about this a week ago and 2 weeks ago, and now we're under a lot of pressure to pass this when we've got a deadline of March 1st. So that's how I'm feeling.
Well, I don't think there's been any progress on the request to delay the implementation date that I'm aware of.
So I spoke with Director Gothier on Friday. He said that he was told that the letter had been mailed to him. He had, of course, he's trying to get an opinion from the lawyers that represent the training council on a document they're not reading and holding, so it was pretty impossible for them to give an opinion. He didn't feel that even if they asked for an extension, that unless the statute itself was changed with the due date for the final document, that his lawyer would ever sign off on agreeing to that request.
And the legislature has not taken action to extend the deadline, which they could have done.
Not that I'm aware of.
I think although there are components of this discussion that have come up really rapidly, at the same time, this is a discussion from a community values perspective that began here well before I was even on the council. And I think it's just time for us, me personally, I believe it's time for us to stand up and take that clear community position and say, we're drawing that red line between how we police and Winooski.
We did have this discussion around sanctuary cities, and I think one of the big issues that came up that we grappled with was, are there going to be unintended consequences of essentially taking a political stand? And one of the concerns at the time, and that I continue to have, is by knowingly violating federal law, are we inviting increased federal intervention in our community in a way that doesn't make people safer?
mean, I think that that is a valid concern. I don't think that the policy and these recommended changes to the policy is about taking a political stand. I think it's about operationally how we carry out the functions of policing here in Winooski. But I appreciate that concern, and I agree with it. I don't think that that's something we're seeing actualized, and I think if we're looking at priorities of immigration enforcement nationally, with areas that the organizations responsible for that enforcement would likely consider a lot more target-rich, who they're also having that political disagreement with, like San Francisco and Philadelphia. I would not envision Winooski being high up on the target list, the small community we have here. But that's not to say it's not a valid concern.
Yes.
When we spoke about this earlier, you had referenced San Francisco and Philadelphia, but you also said that they have not gone as far as this proposal, which would be to eliminate references to the savings clause.
I
Is
think
that
there are sections
correct?
that do not have the savings clause. From what I would have to go back and read, but I believe that Philadelphia, for instance, doesn't have a savings clause around communicating information for victims and witnesses. So I think that's a big issue of contention for Philadelphia. But I don't know those policies as inside and out.
Yeah, but this recommendation that you're presenting would strike all references to savings clauses throughout the policy.
Yes.
So there's no other municipality that we know of that's done that in our region.
I'm not sure. There might well be. There might be smaller municipalities as well. You know, I feel the difference in a lot of the arguments that places like Philadelphia or San Francisco are making are saying that their policies, they're walking that tightrope of saying their policies are in fact compliant with federal law, which would differentiate the decision that we might make here as a body. Smaller municipalities that also wouldn't get as much press, so we likely might not know about them, might go farther than those. It might not be trying to walk that tightrope. They might be saying, no, we're not going to create a law that we think express, that meets an interpretation of how federal law is being carried out. Whereas, Burlington, Philadelphia, San Francisco have a different perspective by which they're coming to that discussion.
And that's a resource allocation decision. I mean, I think there's not an interest on anybody's behalf in not having attorneys look at things. If it were a resource that didn't have a cap, we'd have attorneys look at everything all day and make sure that we were absolutely crossing our eyes and construct the best argument from a legal perspective that we possibly could one way or the other. Those other cities have taken those resources, invested them, and taken their stand using those legal arguments. My perception when I say it's not reasonable for us to undertake a large a legal unearthing and argument development in this case in places, I think that there just needs to be acknowledgement of what we're doing and call it what it is. And if we do that, we need to understand the risk and repercussions of that, and we need to understand what subsequent actions we might have to take. Because I don't think it's reasonable for us to ask with our resources, staff, or our legal budget to take the time to construct what is a very complex legal argument with no real clear boundaries right now and no clear rails. So again, I understand that can be perceived as even reckless in some measure. I think it's acknowledging the fact that if we're going down this path, let's say what it is, and understand that we're not going to construct that complex legal argument to say, oh, we actually think that we are in full compliance. I think the advice we're receiving is if we take the steps that we very likely will be found not to be.
Right, and what I guess my point is not to have an attorney advise us on a complicated legal argument, but advise us on the risks.
Well, when we submit to the Attorney General, they're going to advise us.
Yeah, and we can always recalibrate. I think that's one of the things, we're not saying we're going to pass this policy and then it gets put under some lock where it can never be reopened again. And if there is some trigger where one of those hypothetical crazy situations we couldn't have occurs, we can open it back up and revisit it.
Yeah, I would just say from a value standpoint, I think we should put our best foot forward on a policy that we think represents our community. And I think, what you presented to us, Eric, does that. expect there to be some difficult conversations if that's the way we move forward. And Nicole, I appreciate your points there. But I think we will get some legal advice, like I said, when we submit whatever we submit to the Attorney General. That'll open up will give us some clarity on what happens next. And I really appreciate, Eric, you saying that, this isn't shoved in a lockbox and never to be touched again. Last week or 2 weeks ago when we had the original discussion, I had some real concerns around process for all this stuff. And what I keep coming back to over the past couple of weeks thinking about this is that we will have an opportunity to have some discussion around it. This isn't just a spigot that gets turned off and all of a sudden everything is shut down. That may happen still. Everything may, we may have a certain number of spigots shut off to us. But I think we can have communication and conversation around this as those issues arise. I think I'm not just saying that because I'm not going to be sitting up here in a couple of weeks. Sure, but
that doesn't make it easy.
But as a community member, I really appreciate that this is a policy that, in my opinion, helps our police department make the best decisions for the people in our community. I look at this a lot from the perspective of what if I am a witness with a questionable immigration status? How are people interacting with me? If I'm that person and I can have the police department telling you that we have policies in place to just so you know that we will not be communicating this information, more information to a federal agency, that makes me more open to speaking to our law enforcement agents. So I think this is the right move. I would never pretend to be a lawyer and know that all this is fully vetted, and would hope that there is some feedback. I'm sure we'll get plenty of feedback, but that we just have some thoughtful conversations around that. And at a certain point, there may need to be some legal advice that we pay for around this, which I know isn't the conversation you want to have, but at a certain point, I would think have to happen. So people sitting up here are going to have to make that decision too. That being said, I do want to make sure too that we find a way to support those safety measures that the Chief's Department was relying on. It's not a huge lift, I don't think. Every dollar is a huge lift, right? Like that budget process we went through was brutal over what seemed like pennies. So $10,000 is not insignificant, but in the broad scope of things, it's pretty minor. But that is going to provide a major asset to the department to have those extra safety measures. So I would hope that conversation will be happening simultaneously on how to find that money to make up for that. So then inevitably, if that gets taken, then we have some backup for that. So that's not this.
Question on the public, anybody else?
I think it's been pretty well covered.
So we're going to open up for public comment now. If it's not an inconvenience for you, we would appreciate, Mike especially would appreciate, if you could come up, just kind of up to the front here. If that's not onerous for you from a physical standpoint, if it is, please feel free to speak from your seat. We do ask that you please just identify yourself by name. We would appreciate that. And if folks want to raise their hand, I'll call them up. And like I said, we can keep public comment just because of the crowd size today. We do have more of an agenda to about 2 minutes. So I appreciate you being respectful of that. And if somebody goes over a few seconds and everybody's, hey, we'll keep that even a little flexible. So with that, we'll entertain public comment. And just want to remind folks too, we always do in situations where we have a crowd that when you address this body, that's what you're doing, is you're talking to the city council. So not to the other people in the crowd, so we don't end up with
conversations going back and forth. There's an awesome parking lot out there that's not too cold if you have this conversation. Okay, and so with that, we'll open it up. Yes, ma'am.
Hello. And I'll time myself, so.
Whoa.
So great. I'm Representative Deanna Gonzalez. I'm one of your representatives, and I'm fighting a cold, so I apologize for my voice. But I am here because I was part of the sponsors for Act 54, which was part of fair and impartial policing. And so I'm here to talk about legislative intent and some of the process from a legislative perspective of how we got here today. And so in that, really the intent was to support and encourage local municipalities to have policing policies that protected all citizens, that across Vermont we've had very consistent police interactions, particularly with communities of color, and at the state level, we're really needing to have a uniform policy, a floor, a policy that municipalities could adopt, that municipalities were not coming up with that on their own. So that was the intent of it, and in the process of it, some of the previous fair and impartial policing model key points were lost. And so a lot of that was around immigration status and perceived immigration status was lost in that. And during conversations that I was part of around, with the training council around how they got to the policy that they got to, part of what they shared was that it was actually a training capacity issue, that they were having difficulty, if not impossibility, of finding trainers who are willing to train on the issue of immigration status. And so at the municipal level, you all have done above and beyond police training that the state requires and have the ability, have already done that additional training and already been able to provide officers with the skills that they need. And so I wanted to put that perspective as well, that it was had a lot to do with training, which at the municipality level you all can address. So that's my time, and thank you all so much for taking up this issue, and thank you for your service.
Thank you. Thanks for your service. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, my name is Kim Jordan, and I am a board member of the ACLU of Vermont and the National Board Representative from Vermont on the National ACLU Board. And months ago, April, I met you, Chief, and hello, Jesse, I think it was maybe one of your first weeks on the job, about the ACLU's model city policy that was put forth on a national level in response to Trump's proposed immigration laws and deportation plan. And it was looked at as sort of a safety measure that regardless of what various states instituted with fair and impartial policing, although that wasn't the phrasing that they used, various cities could adopt particular measures. And Winooski has, again, just to mimic the language, gone above and beyond what was recommended. So I have here a copy of the document that we explored when we met months ago. I just want to bring up a note about federal law from the ACLU. And the statement is, the Trump administration has asserted falsely that if localities do not help advance the deportation agenda, they're violating federal law. So the following rule would be applicable, the only applicable federal law in this area, which would help ensure our city establishes its clear intent not to violate federal law. So there's particular phrasing that if Winooski so chose, in adopting these policy, could add a specific phrasing that there is not intent to violate federal law. And there's particular language here that I'm happy to share with you. It's the 1373 rule. So we all know that one. I don't even have to go over it, but I will. It says, there are all these acronyms. Under 8 USC, subparagraph 1373, la la la, essentially, federal law prohibits the Winooski officials from imposing limits on maintaining, exchanging, sending, or receiving information regarding citizenship and immigration status with any federal, state, or local government entity. Nothing in Winooski policies is intended to violate this subparagraph and suborder. So I just want to offer that there is proposed language vetted by ACLU legal staff that might be relevant here if you want to say that there is no intent to violate federal law. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
My name is Payne Morgan, and I'm a resident here in Winooski. And there's usually not many issues outside of my day job, which is a project developer for a solar company, that gets me into town hall meetings because I have to spend enough time with them on the other side of the table, which is great. It's fun. And what comes up a lot in those conversations is always not in my backyard, kind of, we don't want to see this here. And, you know, always there's valid arguments in those types of feelings. And I feel like with an issue like this, when it's something that is tangible and rubber meets the road, so to speak, that it's really important to take a stand. And speaking as someone who is an American citizen, who's a white man, I don't really get directly affected by the police officers in this community. I don't think I've ever seen a Winooski police officer directly or engaged with them yet, which is good. But others don't have that luxury, so I feel safer in a community where everyone in my community can have that. And Winooski has such a cool, vibrant culture which stems from our diversity, and so I think, I don't know the nuance of the bill or the law, but if we're in a position where it's unknown and known, we know we can take a tangible step that is really, you know, above and beyond what the status quo is for this piece of legislation. And I think as a community that has that kind of intrinsic value, it's really important, what I would want as a resident here. So.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Lauren Sampson, and I have thoughts and want to support the language that Eric proposed from 3 different perspectives. Firstly, I'm an attorney. I practice, about 50% of my practice is in immigration law, and I wanted to say that I think strengthening the language of a policy will provide clarity not just for residents, but for those who in the future are implementing that law. It'll make, there are ways, I think, have been expressed to sort of both comply with federal law as well as to express support for this community in a way that is clear and fair and will protect the community as a whole. Secondly, as a volunteer with the Winooski Community Justice Center, which serves a lot of members of the immigrant community, I've seen what the impact of that has been in sort of ensuring that people feel welcome, that they feel supported, that they support their interactions with the police department, which of course is what the Community Justice Center operates through, and it's important to make sure that people still feel like they can talk to and be honest with police officers, which is part of that restorative process. And lastly, I myself am an immigrant on a visa that many people have never heard of, and it doesn't come with a card with a picture, but instead is a piece of paper in my passport, which I rarely carry. And as a result, there are moments where you feel uncertain, and those might be in your interactions with local law enforcement or when you come to something like City Hall. And knowing that I can stand up here and make a statement about what is a somewhat firestorm political issue without feeling like I'm going to be deported is important to me, and I hope is a benefit to this community. Thank you.
Thank you. Awesome. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Good evening, my name is Will Lambeck. I'm a staff member with the organization Migrant Justice. We're a statewide organization founded and led by immigrant farm workers in the state of Vermont. And we've been a named stakeholder in several successive statutes that have created statutory guidelines for the model fair and impartial policing policy. So I can give a little bit of context and background on this sort of question about state statutory compliance and if Winooski can step away from the model policy. And the short answer is to echo what Eric said, is the state statute sets a floor but not a ceiling. And in 2012, we helped to craft and pass Act 132, which sort of set up a voluntary system for departments should adopt what was then called bias-free policing policies. Many didn't, so in 2014 we went back to the State House, helped to craft and pass Act 193, which said, okay, departments must adopt a policy and create a process for creating the first model policy, which was ratified in 2016. But what happened was that many departments didn't fully implement the model policy. So that's why the language in Act 54, which was passed last year, seems to be saying, like, verbatim, we have to adopt at a minimum the elements, but what that's really saying is, what it says is adopt at a minimum the elements, but you can go beyond that. So our reading of the statute is that it would get sent to the Attorney General, but that there would not be any problem with the policy being statutorily compliant, because it would have the minimum protections included in the state model policy and then go significantly beyond those protections. So that's our reading of the statutory guidelines, and that in making that determination, the Attorney General wouldn't have to do a review of federal statutory compliance, because that's not what's in the state statute. It's just saying you have to have the protections in the model policy, but you can go beyond them. As a matter of public policy, I heard you all say that there's not really a debate here around the values, so I won't spend much time on that. I'm sure you'll hear from other folks some of those values. But this is much sounder public policy than the state model policy. We've worked extensively as a stakeholder with law enforcement and a number of others. And at the end of the day, we have this sort of mishmash compromise language that, to be honest, is really quite confusing for officers themselves, and in my interactions speaking with officers who've read the model policy, because it's trying to walk this complicated line, saying, don't enforce immigration except for these loopholes and these carve-outs and these savings clauses. By cutting through all that red tape, Winooski would create a much clearer and easier to implement policy, just basically telling officers, it's not your job, don't get involved with federal immigration enforcement, focus on public safety. And so I think having a clear policy is vastly to the benefit of Winooski. And finally, our reading is that similar to what's been said, that Winooski, by taking out the 1373 and 1644 savings clause, would put itself into somewhat uncharted territory. However, of the courts that have looked at the Trump administration's attempts to defund cities, particularly Federal District Court in Pennsylvania, in Chicago, and Federal Appeals Court, the Ninth Circuit, and a California case, they've all sided with municipalities and against the Trump administration on the key elements of these legal debates. Those are obviously still wending their way through the courts. Who knows what will happen if it gets to the Supreme Court, and who knows how the Department of Justice will respond to that. But as Eric and others have said, this doesn't shut the door on the debate. It sets a clear statement of values, and then the council can respond as circumstances shift. So I'll end my remarks there, but Mike Justice fully supports the letter that Eric put forward. We think it will result in a vastly superior policy, and will be an alternative model, frankly, for other municipalities who are looking to go above and beyond what the state model policy has ended up as.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just want to pause really quickly, make a point of clarification in that during our conversations too, at no point have we advocated that that any of these concepts or ideas are knowingly acting in blatant disregard of federal law. When we talk about knowingly and acknowledging the steps that we're taking, it's acknowledging the fact that we're going outside of the parameters and that there could be some repercussions for that and some additional action taken. And that's really an important point of clarification that has come up a couple different times here, that we're not actively seeking to not be in compliance, right? Our argument would be that, hey, we've done our best here to comply with the values of our community, along with the foundation basis that we were given from the model policy standpoint. Just want to put that on tape. Okay. Yes, sir.
Dana Rushford, I'm just a concerned tax-paying, business-owning citizen in the state of Vermont here, and I do a lot of business in the city of Winooski. And my concern is we just had a presentation about public safety prior to this, and now, you know, and then listening to the discussion that you had amongst yourselves, it sounds like you're going into this pretty blindly and, you know, taking the risk of defying federal law for starters. And just wanted to say that, you know, that I'm more concerned about the public safety. I mean, we don't really have, you know, as of yet, thank God, we don't have a problem with you know, public safety outside of the illegals that may be here or may not be here. But by running the risk of not communicating with the federal agencies, you don't know if you don't have, you know, have a fugitive maybe that you have that ICE is looking for or whatnot. You don't know that this person is wanted in Texas for whatever, for crossing the border, bringing drugs in, coming up from New York City. You just don't know by skipping out on communicating with federal agencies, and I just think it's very irresponsible.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
First of all, I just want to say my name is Jenny Bauer. People are not illegal. I think protecting our community members means protecting the safety of everyone. We're seeing in the 100-mile enforcement boundary, which Winooski is part of, people being detained from Greyhound buses, being ripped from medical appointments, and everyone of all ages and life circumstances being put at risk who would be in the situation of having their status questioned. So I think this represents a real opportunity for our community to make a statement and show where our values lie and support our neighbors and community members. I think we should lead by example, and rather than be concerned about repercussions, I think there are support systems. The Attorney General will look at this, and that we should really band together and have a lot of faith in our community as a strong and supportive resource and home. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is David Kupersky, and I am a resident of Winooski, Vermont. I am a member of the Vermont Workers' Center, Migrant Justice, and the Vermont Poor People's Campaign. I have been in construction labor most of my life, and I have always lived in poverty. At times, I have had no choice but to work under the table, and I had even lived in France for a year in an effort to start a bicycle racing training camp as a so-called illegal immigrant. Life has not always been easy for me while trying to rise from poverty by working many, many hours to no avail. Despite my story of struggle here in America and in France, I deserve respect and human rights. Today, I went to a protest in Rickford for Jose Luis Cordova. He is a husband and a father of 3. He works on a local dairy farm and sends his money back home to support his wife and kids. He was arrested when he went to a dentist appointment to have his teeth cleaned. Excuse me. I went to this protest to support a hard-working family man who was just trying to make a better life for his family. I have much respect for him and a great understanding of just how difficult it is in this world to rise from poverty. Not only that, I appreciate the dairy products that are created by his work. This evening we are to discuss fair and impartial policing, or FIP. So I simply ask, fair and impartial policing? What, are you kidding me? Is this not what police are paid to do? Is it not their job to be fair and impartial? Hasn't it always been this way? Or is fair and impartial policing now illegal? I hear that Winooski Police Department are in support of the FIP, and why wouldn't they be? Because they are leaders and respect the working class and human rights. The problem arises because of Trump's rather fascist-led threats of cutting funding to the department. Simply put, morality trumps legality. Please respect human rights. The lost funding is unconstitutional, and the funding can be found from other sources. If the Winooski, Vermont Police Department can take the lead, other departments will be sure to follow. Thank you.
comments.
Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Enrique Balcázar. I don't speak English really well. I'm learning, but I has been in Vermont for 7 years. I don't have document. It's really sad because I'm a young man working. I was working in a dairy farm for 3 years, milking cows in 4 different farms around the state, and I love Vermont. Vermont is my second home. Y bueno, estamos aquí porque queremos expresarnos, ¿no? No queremos seguir viviendo en las sombras, no queremos seguir teniendo miedo, andar por las calles.
And we're here today because we want to be able to express our beliefs and not live in the shadows, not live in fear, but to be able to walk the streets of this town and say our piece.
Y bueno, yo ahora vivo en Burlington, estoy pensando mudarme a vivir a Winooski, estoy en búsqueda de casa y todo eso con mi novia Zully que está ahí. Y bueno, es un lugar que está muy cerca y que siempre estoy alrededor del pueblo.
Currently I'm a resident in Burlington, but my girlfriend Suli and I are looking for a new apartment and are thinking about moving to Winooski, and it's a town we know well because we live close by and are always coming through here.
Y bueno, queremos vivir en un lugar, ¿no? Donde, bueno, tenemos confianza, somos una comunidad que realmente, como lo repito, vivimos en las sombras y nunca hemos tenido confianza en la policía, ¿verdad? Por todos los ataques que hay y nos separan de nuestras familias, los niños se quedan aquí, a nosotros nos mandan a nuestros países.
And we want to be able to live in safety. As I said before, we're a community that's often forced to live in the shadows, that's never had the luxury of trusting in police because we've seen the repercussions of deportations and family members our families being torn apart and family members being separated, and that's what we want to do away with.
Y recientemente estaba viendo unas noticias, un joven que tenía su familia, ¿verdad? Y si vio que alguien se estaba metiendo en su casa, inmediatamente llamó a la policía, no recuerdo bien dónde pasó, pero no fue en Vermont, pero la cosa fue que ahora está en deportación, está encarcelado y está en proceso de deportación solo por llamar a la policía.
And I saw a news report recently, and this didn't happen in Vermont, but a young man called the police because somebody was breaking into his family's home, and because of that call to the police, he ended up in detention himself and is now in the process of being deported.
Y bueno, nosotros, ¿verdad? Yo sí me mudo a vivir a Vermont como a Winooski, realmente como quiero vivir tranquilo, ¿verdad? Y quiero crear confianza con la policía de que mis amigos me pueden visitar y que pueden visitar Winooski, conocer Winooski, y también que si nosotros vemos algo podemos tener confianza en poder contar con la policía con toda la energía y el gusto de hacerlo.
When I'm thinking about moving to Winooski, I want to be able to do so knowing that I'll be safe and trusting the police, and knowing that I can tell my friends, when you come to visit me, you aren't going to be putting yourself at risk. And I want to live in a community where I know that there's a resource if I need support in public safety.
Gracias.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Good evening. My name is Aaron Lookman. I'm here tonight out of concern for our undocumented neighbors and their families. Ask City Council to pass the proposed changes to the fair and impartial policing policy. These amendments will build trust between our community and our police department. And on that note, I'd like to thank the Winooski Police Department for their work to keep our community safe and secure. This will help create a safer community for everyone. As someone who's hoping to purchase a house in Winooski in the near future, I understand that these efforts could put us in the Trump administration's targets to threaten sanctuary cities around the country by withholding funds. We may need to find other ways to allocate resources to make sure that our officers have the protective gear they need to do their job. But ultimately, there's no price that we can put on the safety of our neighbors in our community. A vote to strengthen our fair and impartial policing policy is a vote for a safer Winooski, and I thank you for your consideration on this very important issue.
Thank you. Other comments, questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I really don't want to be last, so I hope somebody else talks.
But, it's going to be a big moment.
I know, right? Yeah. So I'm a new Winooski resident. First, I'm not supposed to do that, but I thought it was really nice that that young man, whose name I don't remember, came up and spoke as an undocumented immigrant, and I'm really glad that he's able to do that here and feel like that's something he can do as part of a community. I think it's great that, as you were saying at the beginning, I think that these are values that we're policing with already. I think it was really well said by two other people who I'm not motioning to or looking at. In effect, Eric's policy, it sounded to me like they were saying what I was hoping to say as well, which is it can provide some cover for our officers, right? So there isn't a question of, should I be doing this or shouldn't I? And I think having an unclear policy, if it were me, that I wouldn't want that. I'm sure you can have that conversation with our police. I don't want to speak for you, but I've had that issue with my boss before, with bosses before, and I think in codifying what your values are, you're expressing them. And if you don't do that, in some ways you're saying they're not really my values. So I think, making sure they're presented in a way that the job description lines up with the values, right? Or the codes line up with the values is really important. So thank you for making some clarifications that make that clearer. Happy to be new to Winooski, especially when this type of conversation is happening.
Welcome.
Sorry about the audience, you say.
Nobody noticed. We'll see you at every other meeting going forward, too.
Excuse me, sir, can we have your name?
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm Mike Fife. I'll be at every other meeting.
Any other comments, questions, concerns? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Patty McFett. I've lived here all my life. I worked for the Winooski Community Justice Center for 17 years, and I don't think that anybody tonight questions what our values are. There is not a question. My concern is the slippery slope that we may be on, and I just want to make sure that we're doing the right thing. And when we sit here and we talk about, well, we get the $10,000 from somewhere else. I've been here a long time. It's hard to raise that $10,000. So I just ask you to be cautious about that. Our values are here to work together and to welcome everyone, but I just wanted to make that clear. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Heather Carrington. I'm speaking as a resident of the city. I would just like to remind council that when we have a conversation about sanctuary cities, we had some of our Fort and Warren residents come and warn us about unintended consequences, and I mean consequences way beyond $10,000 worth of jail. So while I think there's, obviously, we have common values here, I think it's really important to consider what those consequences could be on the people that we are most trying to protect.
Thank you. Other questions, comments, concerns? Yes. Going once. Thank you all very much. So we'll now turn back towards council. This is on this evening as a discussion / approval item. We're dealing with the state deadline, so in an ideal way, shape, or form, there will be a motion of some kind put forward that will include some kind of affirmative action to put something forth to comply with that deadline. So appreciate everybody taking the time to speak, and want to remind folks that council at winooskidt.org too
www.winooskibt.org. You can find all of the contact information for all of us here. If you have other thoughts you want to share via email, at least 2 are on the way out the door. There are a couple candidates out there you can also reach out to. Okay, so I'll turn it back towards council now and see if there's any additional thoughts, comments for accepting a motion. Anybody want to address anything else? Yes, ma'am.
I think to me, there's 2 separate issues that potentially take separately, rather than saying, well, you know, say yay or nay to a whole package. So, the work that Eric did to tighten up some of the language that was perceived to be unclear or create loopholes, I think I agree with some of the folks that spoke, would not necessarily constitute a deviation from state law, because it is, the model policy is something that is intended to provide a base level of protection. So I think that's one set of issues that tightening up language and making it clearer makes a lot of sense to me. The other issue is, are we going to, state law also said that the model policy needs to be rewritten to be consistent with federal law. And the proposal that we have would not be consistent with federal law, or at least with what the Department of Justice has said to the state of Vermont. So I'm very appreciative of the comment about language that the ACLU attorneys have developed that says this is not intended in any way to violate federal law, because to me, I could not support something that didn't have that, at least that statement in there. Because I do believe the risks are very unknown, and both to the people who live here who would be most impacted and to the fiscal status of the city. So that's a workaround in terms of eliminating the references throughout the policy, but beginning the policy with that statement. I'm interested in exploring that a little bit further, but I could not support just eliminating all references to federal law when we know that the current version was written in response to a directive from the Department of Justice. So we can say we're not knowingly violating federal law, but we also have a lot of information that suggests that references to those federal statutes have meaning.
Yeah, I was, and I think what I was trying to say in the conversation is we know we're leaving a safe zone, right? And it's important that we acknowledge that it's not about open defiance. It's about doing what you think is right and writing a policy and reflective of what your community values are. And by saying not spending a huge upfront legal budget on it, I think substantiating that from anything that I've seen has waffled back and forth, and there's been nothing conclusive from any of these conversations and other policy reviews. So I just worry we would endlessly spiral down a wormhole of trying to create case law where there is none, and substantiate your argument that just hasn't had enough time to be vetted yet from a legal perspective. So I would completely concur, and I don't know where a statement like that might be appropriate. Maybe it's just a preamble to the policy that states, it's Winooski's intent to comply with all required state and federal law in this policy.
Nothing in this policy is intended to violate that. Whatever language is vetted by some attorney out there is preferable to me than us winging it.
Pretty sure we can probably use that language she gave to us. We had to.
Well, I think that's, I don't think that there is any harm in giving that legislative intent statement. That this is not intended to, intentionally violate any portion of federal law. And I am really appreciative of all the community members that came out to speak in the public hearing tonight. And I think really what resonated with me is that, you know, these are the values that we keep talking about, and this policy is how we enshrine those values. So I would be interested in making a motion to adopt the state's fair and impartial policing model policy with language changes that I have included in my letter that was circulated in those 5 sections, in addition to striking all savings clause references to federal statute 1373 and 1644, amenable to inclusion of a legislative intent statement that the policy was not intended to violate federal law. And I'll let Seth, the master person, wordsmith.
I think you can get that language into the purpose statement, which is basically saying is required to adopt each component of the Vermont criminal justice training with a model, fair, and impartial policing policy. I think what we may adopt additional components. I think we can just add a sentence that says
What's the ACLU said?
What the
Can't just pull it like these.
I agree with
Yeah.
that. What the ACLU said.
That seems like a valid answer.
As vetted, and it doesn't seem to stray away from.
Having not seen that language,
Okay.
I'm not sure.
No, but
I mean, we don't need to, do we need to decide in this very
Nope.
the exact language that
No.
goes in, or that we will have something go in that mirrors the intent that you propose there, that complies with what the, what's been vetted by some lawyers?
I would say that you can pass it with that condition on there. And in doing so to meet the deadline, it's accepting the fact that we're going to do the best we can to comply with that language. And this group would have to acknowledge that.
My only concern, and what I would want to make really clear, is that nothing in that language, having not seen that language, I would not want us to add any additional language that changes the actual substance of the policy. Only language that provides an indication of our legislative intent in passage of the policy.
on that, Angela, or that ink?
What's the final due date again?
March 1st.
March 1? Okay.
So, a recommendation, I think we have Eric's 5 points clearly outlined. I think those changes the chief and I understand how to make. I think if you pass the motion as voted on motion as presented by Eric, it would be helpful to staff to have one of you to vet a final draft with, to make sure it was the intention that you heard from the body, with that language included.
And it's the 5 points plus the 6.
Yeah.
And I'm actually available.
Well, since you volunteered.
Yeah. Way to raise your
I'll
hand.
do it, I'll do it.
Way to raise your hand.
Okay, so we have a long winding motion forward that includes adopting the policy with the insertions and deletions as noted in the memo shared by Councilor Covey, in addition to adding language in the purpose section that reflects the intent of the council to pass a policy that complies with federal law.
Second.
Motion by Eric, second by Brian Corrigan. Any further discussion?
And I just, it doesn't need to be on the motion, but our intent is to take the feedback from the Attorney General's office and come back and have a discussion about whatever feedback we receive.
I would just add to that I think that we had discussed previously the concept of potentially taking an advocacy route. And I think that this will naturally place us in a position where we will be in an advocacy route in terms of communicating with the drafters of this, and that it will absolutely cause, I think, this to come back. So I don't think we can put a nice deadline on that, but I think we'll be having this conversation from a how it was received concept and probably pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So it'll be a new body, new council.
Right. I would not want to promote this action on this, use city resources to promote the fact that this action was taken, because I think, again, because of concerns for folks who live here, not wanting to sort of say, look what we've done, that to me increases the risk of ICE hanging out outside the community justice, or the community center, or whatever. So I would just, I want to make sure that we're not planning a press release about this, because to me that actually is counterproductive and makes it more of a political action than a policy direction that this body is setting.
Noted. Thank you. So we have a standing motion by Eric with a second by Brian Corrigan. Any further discussions, comments? Okay. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. And those opposed? Those abstained? Motion carries. Want to extend sincere and grateful appreciation, first and foremost, for the way you're already doing business and for your patience with this body as we navigate this conversation, and the professionalism with exuded and exemplified at every step of the way. Thank you very much, Chief. We appreciate it. And to Jesse, thank you very much. We appreciate all your work. Thank you very much.
Start working on the alternative ones.
Let's take a 2-minute resource. We'll reconvene at.
Oh, thank you.
We're gonna pick up item I, discussion transportation alternatives, grant application, biking pedestrian improvements to downtown.
I'm shocked that people didn't stay for this. So I'm coming to you in a little bit of a strange order here, in part because the due date for this application for the Downtown Transportation Grant Fund is March 19th. So due to the way that falls and the approvals that I will need in the process, I'm a little bit at the early end of this.
It tells me we're gonna be okay with that.
Yeah, we'll see. But anyway, I wanted to let you know that we are eligible for a Downtown Transportation Grant Fund, and I spoke with Gary Holloway, the director of the Vermont Downtown Program, and he encouraged Winooski to apply for this grant. We have not received it in the last few years, and so we'll never receive it, I think, actually. So I think this is an opportunity for us. It's up to $100,000 with a 50-50 grant match for the municipality. In-kind matching is allowed. So we as staff are looking at a couple of different options for the way that we could utilize these funds based on our previous conversations about the Main Street project. There's been a lot of talk about bike infrastructure for the city, and what I am proposing and have spoken to Gary about is that we use these funds in part to support a bike share program with Gotcha Bikes that is being proposed by CATMA for, in the first phase, Winooski, Burlington, and South Burlington. That will be made up of 100 bikes, 15 bike hubs, and they're smart bikes, so what they'll do is they will catalog where the trips are and how many hours are used and where the trips are initiated, etc. So that'd be useful information for us to have. It will also involve 25 bikes that are e-assist bikes, so they're electric bikes when necessary, so that will help people with things like the hill up to university. So it seems like this would be a good match. Because I've been speaking with Gary and trying to figure out a way for us to make this work with the grant program, I'm waiting to hear back on whether we can cover bikes that will be moving throughout a multi-municipal city. So that may not be possible. In the case that that's not possible, what we would propose to do would be to go forward with doing pedestrian improvements for the downtown, including improving the tree pits, sidewalks, brick pavers. So while I don't yet have an estimate because I don't know which one we're going for, I kind of wanted to get some guidance from you on what the appetite is. I believe that what we'll do is a combination of in-kind match with the labor of DPW in putting in some of these things. And also we would have to have some cash match as well. We could take that kind of improvement.
So our intention with the conversation today was really to lay out those concepts that haven't yet been fully approved by the funder. So when we hear back in the next few days, and if there is that special meeting right before town meeting, that we could put it on an approval agenda then to get approval before the deadline.
Right.
So just wanted to see if there are any red flags with either of those concepts.
I think both concepts are substantially supportive of every endeavor we've undertaken to increase multiple modes of transportation in the city. Bikes are awesome. Bike shares are so cool. I was just in Portland, Oregon, and used one myself. The colors, I'd love to hear more about that. They tend to be like bright orange with a little basket. That's okay. Those are less stolen.
I should add one of the things in this phase one, what was intended was for there to be one bike hub in Winooski down on Winooski Falls Way. If we were to go for these funds, what I would advocate, and I've spoken with some of the from CCRPC about this, would be to go for 2 bike hubs, one at the top of Main Street and one down, or up on the top of Weaver Street and one downtown, just so we have the ability to travel within Winooski, not just to and from Winooski.
Great idea.
I just have a question about the Weaver Street work. That CCRPC, we've applied for that money, or do we not know?
We have
to
put
do this engineering on the Weaver Street project.
We have put in a what do they call it, UPWP, the
Unified Work Plan request
for that, to CCRPC for the FY19 work plan process. And thus far, we've got some questions about other applications, but not on that one. So we believe it is well within their queue.
Okay. I'm just wondering if there's a way to sort of leverage those two activities with this type of funding source.
It's something that I discussed with Gary a little bit, and also with Jonathan Rauscher. And one of the problems is because Weaver, it's mostly for capital improvements here, and because Weaver is going to be a pilot project over the next couple of years, I don't know that we could make capital improvements with that, which is the purpose of this funding.
So,
but we could maybe match.
We could match.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So given that, could I recommend that we stack those three options and understand, look at the terms, see the in-kind, what that looks like, understand it's a great opportunity, and let staff make the final call on either three of those things? I think you're all aware of how important the Weaver Street bike facility is from a priority standpoint for us. But with that being said, if the application better suits one of those other two items, that we allow some flexibility to go for those. Does that sound okay? I think it's a great point to bring up, and one that was in the back of my brain too.
This is from.
That's why you're which hemisphere? All right, so with that, other questions or concerns from council? Questions or concerns from the public? So, let's see.
Discussion item, it's just a discussion item. I was just looking for guidance on what the appetite was. So. Okay.
Very hard.
Thank you very much.
Item J, approval of National Recreation and Parks Association grant application. Heather, thank you very much.
Hello, this is an approval, hopefully, so if anybody's feeling the need to stamp something, hopefully positively. So we came across this recently, Alicia and I, in our travels through Grant Searching World. It is a $40,000 opportunity through the National Rec and Parks Association to support their initiative, the 10-Minute Walk Initiative. So basic premise of that is that everybody in urban areas or cities in the United States is within a 10-minute walk of a park or green space. As you'll see in the map I included in the packet, we have achieved that already by doing nothing. So congratulations to us. I don't want to say nothing. There's been a lot of work over the years to establish the park system that we have. We're looking at a couple things in the context of this. One, how do we codify our work around maintaining those parks, improving connectivity and access to those parks, and also exploring some concepts of universal accessibility in perhaps a few key facilities in our community. Right now, I think while it's great that we have that 10-minute coverage, that doesn't mean there's a playground within 10 minutes of everybody or a natural area. We have kind of a mishmash, and so I think trying to look at that, how things are scattered and how that responds to the community is important. So really using this funding opportunity to do some more intentional planning and being a little bit more thoughtful about how we're cultivating our park system in the city. It's competitive, it's 12 to 13 grants nationally, so I don't want to false illusions that this is going to be a slam dunk, but I think given where we are with our municipal planning process and how the timing of this opportunity overlays with that, I think we have a really a good chance to be competitive here by kind of highlighting the opportunities to get some of the work that this funds codified in the master plan that we're working on. So we're excited. It's a quick turnaround. It's due March 9th. We would find out by April 1st. So the other good thing is that we're not going to be waiting on this funding source for months and months. We'll know in pretty short order if we've got it or not, and then we can pivot accordingly to kind of approach the master plan with or without the funding. We're kind of preparing plan B if this doesn't come through. So.
Great. Looks like a good promotional partner too from an effort standpoint.
Yeah. So the one. What's that?
We'd be featured in the first
recreation magazine. I know. Yeah, so the one thing that is in here from a more short-term perspective is having the mayor sign on to this initiative nationally. So as I mentioned in the cover sheet there, Burlington and Montpelier are the other two Vermont cities that have signed on. But that is one of the prerequisites to applying to the grant is that the mayor and the city does need to sign on. So that's included in there that campaign cover sheet. So I just wanted to call that out specifically as kind of an immediate action item, and then from there we, depending on your decision, go ahead and apply for this grant or not.
My pin only has ink in it if you give it to me, folks. Any
Does
questions?
council get to pose in a picture?
Parks and Recreation.
That's current council.
I feel the way
The Bryans have never been shy for photos.
So in the interest of keeping the agenda moving, any
Yeah.
questions? Any questions, concerns, comments from the public? So seeing and hearing none, I would entertain a motion for approval of the National Recreation and Park Association grant applications for 10-minute walk campaign.
So moved.
Motion by Brian Corrigan, second motion by Brian Sweeney, second by Brian Corrigan. Any further discussion? Seeing and hearing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
And those opposed, motion carries.
Thank
Thank you very much. I
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Keep
Ray.
it
That's
posted.
a great opportunity too. Excited you guys found that. Then a discussion item for the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission ECOS draft regional plan feedback.
So, the ECOS plan is the countywide equivalent of the municipal master plan. They're updating it. They have asked us for feedback. Staff spent some time at the leadership team meeting recently, reviewing these documents and providing some concepts for feedback to CCRPC. This is not required, but we wanted to provide you with the documents, the great summary documents that CCRPC provided us, and here if you had any feedback you'd like us to include in staff's feedback as well. Finally, these documents have also been shared with the Planning Commission, and the intention is to ensure that our municipal plan kind of marries up to the ECOS plan as well, to, again, not only in that shared vision work plan for the region, but also in the attempt to leverage future funding opportunities. We will be most competitive when those two plans align.
Yeah, I think the SEDS is under, the community economic development plans under, strategy is under review too. But we're in a really good place, I think, from a cohesion with the plan standpoint. And we've worked so closely with CCRPC on all of our planning. We really almost, by residue of all that, right, we've fallen into compliance because of the philosophical connection between us and their organization and all the tremendous support that they provided us. Can't say enough how important the CCRPC is in bringing resources, technical expertise that it's not reasonable to expect any town in Vermont really to sustain on our own. So, really wonderful resource. So, the question kind of came up, what should we do with this when this came about? I just said, let's throw it out and see if anybody has any questions, concerns, comments about any of the items that you've read in here from a prioritization standpoint. Nice little summary document. If you want to read the full ECOS, we have the link to that too. It's actually a pretty interesting read, and I encourage people to do so. It takes a really, obviously, regional look at everything, which I think, we get so focused on what we're doing in Winooski and how we're trying to achieve our goals that it puts in a larger context is pretty interesting. It also will probably make you feel pretty good about where we're at with planning and our conversations and things we're focusing on. Whereas you read it a couple years ago and it made you anxious. You're like, I'm not doing that. Now it's kind of like, wait a second, we're on top of that.
Yeah.
Any questions that we would like to send back from a feedback perspective? Big thanks to Jesse for monitoring this. Big thanks to Mike O'Brien, who's our representative to the Regional Planning Commission, too, for all his work, advocacy, and follow-up. I'm sure he's got comments and questions on it. My little tofu is not here. Yes.
I don't have any feedback. I'm interested in, did you guys have any concerns through the leadership team discussion?
Not concerns. There were a few areas we will send back to them just to make sure that they are that they are emphasizing, pushing the boundaries of their comfort and emphasizing. That is making sure that our priorities around Main Street and affordable housing, Main Street revitalization, that is a priority project. Affordable housing are really highlighted. They are, but we want to just underpin that. Heather brought up the good point of ensuring that the public transportation goals speak to the equity of public transportation across the region. We have pretty good public transportation here in Winooski, but are those truly extending to our partners in Colchester and farther out in the county to allow our residents to get to employment opportunities in other communities, and vice versa, people from other communities coming into workforce opportunities here. And then they talk in the economic development section about childcare affordability. We believe that there really needs to be, Ray brought the point up that there really needs to be an underlining about childcare capacity and access. So wanting to add a few comments to that section as well. Again, nothing that's earth-shattering that they haven't thought of, but really trying to underline some points that they have included. Right? Good points.
Other questions, comments, or concerns for staff to take today? Any questions, concerns, comments from the public?
They're really quiet today.
Thank you for all of your work on that. Appreciate it. Okay, we'll move to item L, which is approval of position description, community services transport driver.
So largely a housekeeping item here. As folks may remember, we had a driver for our senior center program for as long as I've been here, until October, Jim Ward. We had hoped to backfill his position when he retired with some volunteer drivers and have not had any takers. So we are going to basically leverage funds that had already been allocated for that position, but in going to post and hire for that job, we realized there was no job description. So we are working on developing that, but as part of our policy work committee with a basic purpose and title and the funding and expenditure sources.
This might be the most straightforward one we've ever seen.
Yeah.
Very specific task.
Yes.
Questions, concerns, or comments from council?
I like that it added up to 100% this time.
I tried.
Put in other duties as well. Any additional questions, comments, concerns? Any questions, concerns, comments from the public? Very good. So seeing and hearing none, I entertain a motion for approval of the position description for the community services transport driver.
Second.
Motion by Brian Corey, second by Eric. Any further discussion? Seeing and hearing none, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. And those opposed, motion carries.
I should mention we are now hiring for a community services transport.
Any of you have some free
Please put your application. Brian,
Pays a little better.
Goal update, safe, healthy, connected people.
So this, I believe, is our second or third update on this goal. Let's try to put it right here. As always, we provided a relatively comprehensive update for you. Happy to answer any questions about this. Tonight already we've talked about fair and impartial policing, the community outreach program, several of the items already on here. So regional dispatch, we've talked about length about. Open space we talked about tonight, childcare briefly. Happy to answer any questions, don't need to reread a memo for you.
Specific check-in questions for council in regards to the report. So first of all, I just want to reiterate, these are really great and really helpful. Thank you. They're wonderful benchmarking opportunities for us to kind of follow what's going on and make sure that we're aligning back and forth on what's happening that goes after those sort of larger goals that we have behind us that we've set as a council and as a city jointly with staff. And we deliver those goals together. That's really important.
Can I just suggest going forward, I'm sorry, are we done talking?
No,
absolutely. Going forward, we've known you've got 2 new council seats up here. As a progressive step for these particular grids, it might be advantageous to put in columns for where you were the last time you reported out on this, just so that they know how you're progressing from that history as opposed to where it is right now. Just as it is.
For the narrative as well as the status bars, or?
I think the status bar specifically, because I think that's probably where they'll gravitate to with new folks.
Great.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
So is it true that we will get an update in March on the childcare?
That's the goal. So the operator, the operator, the operator we've been negotiating with, we have set a meeting date for March 12th, and about a month and a half ago established with them a goal of kind of middle of that week. I think March 13th is or 14th is the Wednesday of that week prior to the council meeting to, at that point, either have a letter of intent to bring to council on March 19th or a no thanks, we can't do this decision point. So we have a date set on the calendar that we're moving toward. It's a big deal for them to expand, and I think especially in the environment that childcare is operating, there's a lot of factors at play. Financing being a part, staffing being a bigger part, I think. So they are very smartly doing their diligence, and I think I'm remembering something Eric said a while ago of like, let's not establish something that we can't sustain, and so I do appreciate them. I think they're making that effort to make sure this is an effort that's going to stick. But yeah, we've had ongoing discussions with them, and we're moving along.
Some point of decisions we have to make.
Exactly, yeah. So we set that date for that. Was that second week in March?
Great.
To do that for that.
So we too will ensure as we start to get our brains wrapped around orientation and all those steps come up, we'll make sure there's a comprehensive pool update that comes forward, for example, a progress report on that to update the council, the new council.
Yeah, and we should be fairly close by that March meeting to having a final report from the engineers. That's right around the goal. I can't remember the exact date of that completion, but we're right around there. So
I think this is slightly off topic with this, but for the continuing council, the new council, I think we should think a little strategically about those March meetings, but because we're now hopping a month between meetings and we have the pool, we have Main Street, we have orientation, we have some big agenda items coming up, we might want to think about a special meeting for orientation or 2 meetings in March.
Sure. Well, we already have a special meeting in March that we're going to talk about in just a second.
Another special meeting.
Yeah.
And welcome to the council
Sounds
orientation.
fun to me. You, Brian?
Huh?
You're for the extra meetings in March?
I am all about extra meetings in March.
Okay, thank you guys very much for this. Additional questions from council, please make sure to check in with staff directly. So for tonight's final 2 items, we have warned executive session. We have 2 items going on in regards to a personnel issue. The first is the annual review to take place in executive session. Again, protected under Vermont's open meeting law because it's a personnel action. I want to make it clear that once we complete the review, there will be a public document that has, or there will be a proposal that there's a public document that summarizes a portion summary of that review from an outcome and process perspective. As a reminder, you can find a memo that I wrote in regards to what the review process looked like in previous council packages. We're going to review the results tonight with the city manager and talk about some of the summary pieces. Also, as disclosed in another memo that was submitted in previous meetings, we've also been engaged in contract negotiations with the city manager. There will be several points discussed that to do so in public would put the city at a contractual negotiation disadvantage and would also bring up a personnel issue in a public format that would not be appropriate. What will happen is the council will submit a contract that will be available to the public prior to final approval. We will be considering both of these items and not taking any formal action or vote in executive session. We are going to propose that a special meeting be held to address both issues prior to the expiration of this council. And we will use the very last day available, which will be the Monday prior to town meeting day, which is Monday, March the 5th at 5 or 5:30 p.m. to be determined, where both these items will be heard in a public session and voted for final approval if they progress to that point this evening. Are there other questions, concerns, or comments? As a reminder, we will convene for executive session and only come back from executive session to adjourn. We will not take any additional votes, meaning that the public portion of tonight's meeting's business would be concluded. We'll only be reconvened to adjourn. Any questions, concerns from council? Any questions or concerns from the public? I entertain a motion that we enter into executive session, bringing Jesse Baker for bits and portions, at least, of the 2 executive session items this evening. Motion by Eric, second by Brian Corrigan. Any further discussion? Seeing hearing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
And those opposed, motion carries.
Do you need to hold on to